Hello, Yawer.
And hi, Navio.
Welcome to the new episode for the Cambrian podcast, Caribbean Explosion podcast.
Welcome to our new episode. Yeah. And today, Navio has some very interesting ideas about ideas.
Yeah, the one of the challenge that we're looking at is around producing quality content, and that led me to think about, well, what is creative thinking, what is innovative thinking, and how do you do it systematically? Like, I understand spontaneous creative thinking, but approaching it from a very systematic point of view. Have you ever run into this problem yourself?
Well, I typically don't think of myself as a creative. I know that there are creatives, there are artists, there are musicians, songwriters, singers, poets, all of that spectrum, right? Um, and I know that often you people talk about inspiration. It's like a bolt of lightning that hit them, or it came to them in a dream, or the the story came to them fully formed out of the ether and just came into their heads, and then they had to write it down, like Stephen King has often said about the Dark Tower series. But for me personally, creative thinking, um, I'm I would have to say that I don't think of myself as such, but maybe in some ways I do, because I do often find myself solving problems at work in perhaps unorthodox ways. So maybe there is a bit of a spark of that, but within a particular structure or framework.
So my history with innovative and creative thinking and a systematic approach to it actually starts with me going to Finland, and I went on a student exchange program. And why Finland? Like, I had other choices where I could go, but I was thinking it is a unique place to go to and to experience a unique culture. And when I was there, I one of our professors um, was teaching this course, and I took up this course called Systematic Approach to Innovative Thinking, and it's also called TRIZ. And the professor himself was one of the lead patent people for Samsung out of South Korea. So he was headquartered over there. So I was pretty impressed by his profile, and I was pretty interested in what he was talking about. So I took this course, and so TRIZ is a technology, or it's a approach developed by Altshuller, and I forgive me if I mispronounce his name, but he's basically somebody who was in the Soviet Union, and he was very smart. And because he was very smart, he ended up in the Soviet Siberian camps as well for a while, thanks to Stalin. He was uh, he was exiled over there, and he spent some time around thinking around how to approach uh, approach issues systematically, approach challenges systematically. And while he was at those labor camps, and this is the fascinating thing, there were so many good scientists, other scientists, and intellectuals at those labor camps that he got time to actually discuss his ideas with them and refine them. And around 1954, 56, I forget the exact year, Stalin dies, and he's still a young man, and he was sentenced for life, but he's able to make it back into society, and he's able to apply his ideas and come up with the principles of TRIZ. And so within those principles, the first thing that he talks about is the contradiction, that when you have issues that need to be resolved, they probably have some contradictions that need to be resolved. And by understanding what those specific technical contradictions present the problem, you will narrow down on what to solve. Okay. Then he gives some frameworks to understand the problem and the technical contradiction, like the ideal final result, which is look at the outcome, look at the ideal outcome, and work backwards from there. On functional analysis and how to model a problem. So this one was pretty fascinating. In English, we end up saying that somebody is sitting on a chair. But from a functional analysis perspective, that's not actually true, because it's the chair that is supporting a person. Gravity is applied on the person. They're sitting, they're on top of the chair, and they're falling down, and it's the chair itself which is stopping them from falling. So from a functional analysis perspective, you'd model it slightly differently, which changes how you view the world.
I see. So when you say I'm sitting on a chair, the verb sitting is in the active tense, which makes it sound like I'm doing something active.
Yes.
But in reality, that's not the case. I'm being passive. And the chair is perhaps more accurately described as actively supporting me.
Yes, that's exactly it. Which obviously now your frame of reference on what is doing what is a bit more accurate,
right,
for mathematical modeling and contradiction modeling.
Right.
Then there's also a set of 40 inventive principles, and those inventive principles are taken by or derived by taking the ideal final result, the functional analysis, the contradiction matrix, and looking at patterns and sorting through patterns. And what you end up seeing is that there's a lot of, if you can identify what contradictions are present, it's very easy to identify patterns in other fields to actually end up helping you solve the problem. So you have the same kind of lens at the end of the day. You identify similar lenses in other fields. There's an example of this where I believe it was General Motors, which was able to find a better way to catch the head on a headrest when there's an accident, using principles from glove design from baseball. And Samsung also uses similar technologies in their own design, because obviously my teacher was from Samsung, and their principal patent person. So it was pretty interesting to see this, and it brought within me the idea that innovation in any field, it doesn't need to be just technology, whether we're talking society or whether we're talking our own podcast, can be done, and creativity can be done in a very systematic manner. And when you have that idea and you start looking at other fields, like when you look at filmmaking or you look at songwriting, you start seeing similar kind of patterns start to emerge, which may be different than TRIZ specifically, but there's a lens or a framework of approaching something and making a systematic way of innovating and interpreting data.
So if I can just step back for a second and ask about TRIZ specifically. It sounds like TRIZ is a framework for identifying things that can be patented.
It can be used that way.
Yeah.
The reason that it works through the patent system or comes from that perspective is the patent system, beyond research is one academic research is one place where you find this kind of methodology, systematic way of presenting information, but it's academic research is not applied research. Patents is where you find applied research. And the way that so TRIZ is an engineering principle more than anything else. So it's I've taken away the the high level of thinking about it from the perspective of how do we apply it to other fields as well. But at its core, it's an engineering discipline. And where is the source of truth in engineering? One place of source of truth in engineering is patents.
Mm-hmm.
They describe how processes work
Right.
in a very systematic way so as to protect those processes.
Right.
And therefore, it's a place where you can find the details of those processes, where the contradictions are going to be written. And therefore, the data source kind of allows it to be used in that specific area.
So this is interesting. You're saying companies like Samsung, and I assume other large companies in the
Yeah.
world, technologically advanced companies,
Yeah.
are using frameworks like TRIZ to maximize the potential.
Have used, yeah.
They have used TRIZ to maximize the patentable research that they do.
Yes, that is one of the use cases. There's also, and just remember that at times it's a cultural thing. It might be a department that's doing it, and at other times it might be just one person who is a practitioner who's sitting in a company and is doing it for the company, and while the department might not be looking at it from that perspective. But there are people who follow these principles. In Samsung specifically, that was the patent a professor who was doing it. And one approach of this is actually, one use is definitely finding patents, but the other use is just finding solutions to problems, because sometimes you have a problem and you just need a unique fresh perspective on approaching how to solve for it, and you want to look outside your own industry.
Do you have anything that comes to mind, if a way that this can be applied or was applied, an example perhaps?
I gave you the baseball example, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
GM, you said.
Yeah. GM. I've read of other examples that they're not top of my mind, but if you search it up, you'll be able to find other.
So the baseball example, that's interesting. So a baseball glove is designed to maximize the chance of catching the ball. It has curvature.
When somebody catches with a baseball, they are trying to minimize the injury to their hand. The ball is a hard thing, and it's coming at 90 miles per hour to your hand.
Right.
The speed and the process of catching something like this at that speed and slowing it down, right? That is very similar to what a headrest wants to do with your head.
I see. So the minimizing of the injury to the hand by wearing a baseball glove, that has a mirror effect, like the complementary effect of minimizing the impact on the baseball itself. Because when you minimize the impact on one surface, you automatically are also protecting the other surface as well.
Yes.
So that's how they flipped the reference point perspective, and they said that this can also help to minimize.
Now you're starting to do ideal final result as well as functional analysis while you're talking.
Right.
It's about how you're modeling it, right?
Yeah, you flip your viewpoint.
You flip your viewpoint as well as you're trying to find out the final outcome is not necessarily. The final outcome can be stated as not just reduction in injury, but rather finding the best way of reducing the momentum of something. Right.
And the application of that is to reduce the injury.
Yes.
So I actually have a tendency of jumping ahead to the result. Often, this is a long-standing habit of mine. You can ask teachers in grade school.
Yeah.
They will tell you the same thing.
Yeah, but it's the same kind of process.
Yeah.
I wanted to share TRIZ, but I'm gonna jump into other approaches that are there. We can talk about how do you sort data in the first place? How do you imagine data? How do you what TRIZ is doing is taking a lens through data, right? The patents are the data, and TRIZ is a lens of approaching that data, and there's more than one lens of approaching data points, or some of them might be how you model it. So we had this discussion around knowledge graphs, right? Knowledge graphs are a way to model it, and I'm you mentioned the Zettelkasten method earlier. I'd love to for you to go into a bit into that and explain that to me as well.
Yeah, so I'm finding this interesting because TRIZ, it seems like a way of mining the experiences and knowledge that came out of many patent applications and grants.
Yes.
And trying to find the learning from that. But that is one field of endeavor. But you are more interested in systematizing knowledge in general for more general purpose.
Yes, I'm more interested. This is an example of somebody who's come up with a framework to systematically produce high quality scientific breakthroughs. And when I look at our particular podcast, my thought process is, how do we challenge ourselves to bring about consistently high quality content that our listeners would want to listen to, but also have a systematic way of approaching it, which allows you to, in effect, not really, but in effect, do an apples to apples, or an apples to something that looks like an apple but is actually an orange comparison uh, across different things using the same framework again and again and again. And it doesn't need to be the whole episode, it can just be a part of it, just as a conclusion or a beginning, just to give us a lens of of well, what is a good lens of approaching technology and society and reading technological innovations within a societal context, right? um, that's essentially the challenge that I'm looking at, and TRIZ is just an inspiration in that direction.
So some of the things that you mentioned reminded me of certain techniques that we use in the field of software development. There are ways that we use to organize recurring patterns or practices that come up in software. But just before I talk about that, you mentioned Zettelkasten, so I'll talk about that a little bit. A couple years ago, maybe about a year ago, maybe a bit more than a year ago, I started getting into this thing called the Zettelkasten method. It was created or perhaps formalized by this German academic named Luhmann, and he came up with this method of creating a knowledge base, a personal knowledge base for himself. In modern terms, you could almost think of it as like a personal Wikipedia, which you create by yourself, and you take some effort to organize all of the knowledge that you've come across in your research in terms of notes, which are kind of discrete and separate pieces of knowledge, and then you link them together wherever appropriate. And by these links, they help you to discover new and or before unknown or unthought of links between things that you might not have imagined before. So he found that this was a system that was very useful because it mirrored the structure of his thought processes. And then nowadays, as you said, Nabil, we would call this graph.
Yeah.
Graph theory. Knowledge graph or graph theory.
Yeah.
You, of course, have been talking about knowledge graphs for a long time because you're a research guy. So, and you're all about knowledge graphs and graphs, basically.
Yeah.
Because the web is a graph, obviously.
Yeah.
But we can have our own personal graphs. And I've been using this method at both work and personally to just store any piece of information that comes into my head that I found interesting. I found you know uh, you know XYZ piece of information interesting. I just put that in a note, and it's searchable, full text. I can link it to other notes and then browse them and discover new things, perhaps, or connect things together and have a. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle.
The thing is, we should have a separate episode just covering knowledge graphs, because both from a search perspective and from what you're sharing, it is a fascinating topic in my opinion.
Yeah.
It is absolutely worth understanding why also from a search perspective knowledge graphs are actually the database of choice rather than standard databases and standard ways of storing information, and what makes them special.
It's because to me they mirror the neural structure of our brains. Our brains form memories by neurons connecting to each other and sending electrical signals. And in a way, if you have a Zettelkasten note system that has individual notes which are connected to each other,
Yeah.
which contain pieces of knowledge, that kind of fits very naturally with the way that our human brains work.
I'm agreed. I'm when we do our separate episode, we'll dive deeper into that, because
Agreed.
there's
Let's do that.
there's a whole plethora of like, well, how does our human mind work? Because then you can start modeling knowledge graphs to understand how your own mind works.
Yeah.
And you can explore what makes your biases and your ideas think, that piece of it would be so fascinating. So we'll do an episode on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You were going to talk about some other
Yes, I mentioned in software development we have certain techniques that we use. One technique that I found interesting, and which might apply here as well for systematic knowledge management, is called domain-driven design. This is a pretty old idea. It was introduced back in 2003 by this person called Eric Evans in the book with the same title. And domain-driven design is about in software development, what can happen, the danger is that you create a system to manage some real world application, like let's say a restaurant, and the system can use certain terminologies or techniques which are so far removed from the real world business knowledge that people, the developers and the actual users have no common way of communicating about what's going on, and it can result in confusion whenever a new person comes into the team and tries to, get up to date on the business of the software. So, what was seen as perhaps a better way to model software and the architecture of software was to uh, have this technique where the software itself would mirror the actual terminology and processes of the business itself. So you would have in the software, you would explicitly name the concepts and model them in the same way that conceptually the actual business models it. Like you have in a restaurant, you have the dining area, the front of house, you have the back of house, the kitchen area, you have the storage, you have your, you know, preparation tables, you have the orders coming in, the waiters, servers, you have customers, you have tables have numbers, tables have areas where they are. There could be a smoking section, non-smoking section. Many concepts which have evolved over long use in the industry, which are used by the business. These are all digested and reused in the software world and they are conceptualized as now virtual, models of the real world uh, objects or processes for
So,
people.
so in our case, I'm trying to apply this to our case. In our case, the well, first I'm going to throw that question to you. How would you apply domain-driven design for the challenge of, trying to
Mm-hmm.
improve our podcast
Mm-hmm.
itself?
So I would model it in the way that we are working with our podcast currently. So we have our um, uh, we have a topic which we choose to have an episode on. So we have an episode topic. We have a bunch of sources, citations, resources, discussions, quotes. All of these are bundled together inside a topic. We have, all of what I mentioned. We have any other connected ideas or resources. We have the recording that we do.
The
We have the different platforms that we publish on, media that we want to publish on, and so on and so forth.
the two aspects that I think are interesting to try and I would love to get your thoughts on specifically are how do you measure what is technology, because that's one of the cores that we do, right? We do technology and then we do its social impact or its impact on society. How do you go about measuring those and having a domain driven design for that specific piece? How do you have any thoughts on that?
So domain-driven design is, in a way, it's really meant to apply to one particular um, niche use case, which is to lift the real world knowledge,
Hmm.
which is in the minds and in the processes of your business,
Hmm.
and to um, mirror it in the realm of the software itself, so that the real world knowledge is carried over and the business um, team members are able to quickly ramp up and communicate with developers about using exactly a common terminology. So, a really important concept here is having a common language
Hmm.
for both of the different parties to talk to each other with. So that comes to my mind to the forefront as something that gets really uh, like that's probably the first thing that you need to look at.
Okay, I follow what you're saying. So it's maybe we'll do an exercise of doing that as well.
Yeah, in terms of society, impact of technology, again, all of these things, they all have their domains and they can all be modeled. But the first thing to know is that what is the language in which we are discussing all of these topics,
Yeah, coming to the same semantic
or,
language.
or terminology. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. To me, part of the reason I brought up this discussion is so here's some other tools that I find or frameworks or lenses that I find very useful. I'm just going to quickly run through them because I don't see us taking any one of them, but rather forming our own kind of model which would allow us to view the world the way we want to. It might not be perfect, we can iterate over time on it, but at least starts us getting thinking along the same path of thinking, the steps of thinking, and having the same language of thinking as well, so we communicate our ideas to each other more clearly, as well as to the audience, because at the end of the day, that's one of the reasons I want to do this. But my experience with some of these interesting frameworks, the lean canvas helps translate the product with the market, with a focus on the business aspect of both the product and the market. And it's pretty interesting to view how those two things are supposed to fit together, what problem is being solved, how it's being solved, and whether or not something unique is being offered, if it is an unfair advantage, so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting model from that perspective. The other one is the segmentation, targeting, positioning. How something is segmented, for which audience it is, how that audience is targeted, so what channels are selected, and how is it positioned in for them. I think a lot of technological product pieces, when we talk about the business piece of it, it's interesting to apply the lean canvas to actually understand who the audience, etc., is, and how their problems are being solved by the product, but also then talk about how is it being seen by people, because AI can be solving some very interesting problems, but at the same time it can be seen like it's a really bad thing because it's taking the jobs away, right? So how is it being seen, the positioning piece of it, and then the social impact piece of it. What's actually the impact in there of some of these technological changes that are happening around us, whether it is, whether we use the triple bottom line or the social impact assessment. And the thing is, I'm not as familiar with this, how to measure social benefit, as I am familiar with technology and marketing pieces of it. So that's an area that would be pretty interesting to explore.
Yeah, I see you've laid out a kind of systematic way of looking at it. From any new technology, it becomes perhaps productized, and then it needs to go to the market to prove itself,
Yes,
and then it needs to find its audience to be able to get the market,
yes,
and then finally it will have an impact on society.
yes.
Like you just said, AI can put people out of jobs.
The funniest thing is, when I made these notes, I did not see that framework. You just spotted it for us.
I mean, it's funny because I think you were probably subconsciously proceeding in this particular
Yeah,
order,
yeah.
and it turned out to be like this.
Yeah, which I think is hilarious. That this is
It's a step-by-step analytical framework.
yeah, it is, and it's serendipity.
Exactly.
It just happened. I didn't even think of it that way.
Yeah.
I think this could be an interesting start to lay it out, like product marketing society. At least in our show notes, we should include these three angles, even if it's at the end, and have our bullet points there. And we can always tweak it later on based on iterations.
I agree. This is a pretty good approach, in my opinion. Um, uh, you know, Probably the trickiest part of all of this is as you said, the impact on society. Because when you release something new,
Yeah,
you can never fully understand the impact that it will have. The only thing that you can do is you can try to minimize the harms, perhaps the perceived harms, and then you can try to fix any mistakes. But there will always be unforeseen consequences. So any technology can be used for good or evil. We've seen that plenty of times.
yeah.
Um, People are using. You've heard of the tile tracking chips?
Kind of like the air tags.
Yeah, air tags. Yeah. So tile, air tags, these kinds of things are being used by stalkers to track the location of their victims.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we hear about this in this way. Of course, that was never the intended use case.
I'll go one step further. Look, part of what we say in this show is that you should always be part of political participation.
Yeah.
When you are part of political participation, you actually need to understand these issues in a systematic manner, so that when you're having discussions and when you're asking your representative, hey, tell me about A, B, C, D, you actually know, you have the actual factual background around it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just an emotional piece of it, right? And having a very structured approach to doing these kind of things gives you that that uh, that mechanism to actually have that backing in terms of knowing what you're talking, but also at the same time, if there's like abcd bad misinformation that's there in the process, it should get eliminated, it should be questioned. Even if it is not eliminated, it should end up getting questioned, like, hey, we have different opposing points of view, and it should come out in the process that, you know, you and I have many opposing points of view and different points of view, but that's okay.
Right.
We can discuss it. And the show works when both of us get to present those points of view and the audience gets to decide.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah, agree. I we definitely differ about many of the limits,
Yeah.
but I feel like in general there is a common base that we are both sitting on top of, which is that technology and society and the interaction between them, there's always going to be a lot of push and pull.
Yes, and not only is there going to be a lot of push and pull, oftentimes we don't know the right answer. It is uncharted territory where we have our opinions,
Mhm.
and those opinions can be wrong. My opinion can be
Mhm.
absolutely wrong on something. The idea, it is because it is uncharted territory. The idea of doing it in a very systematic way reduces wrong opinions, and even when you have a wrong opinion, it's coming from a process, that's there to for you to be able to go back and question, where did you go wrong? Like, it's not just an emotional thing.
Yeah, I feel like we are kind of almost touching on a point which we were discussing earlier today at quite great length. And I think we should actually do another episode about that specifically, which is I really want to talk about the scientific method in
Yeah.
this age of social media and mainstream media, information, misinformation, disinformation,
Yeah.
lack of trust in institutions, but also the seeming gullibility of a lot of people to believe everything they see or read on the internet. And I want to frame that in the context of science and what does science and the scientific method have to say about that.
I think that would be a very, very interesting episode to do.
Mhm.
So we've got two episodes in the future that we've planned for.
Mhm.
In addition, if you have any ideas as the audience on how we can be moving the podcast forward, how we can be adding more systematic approaches to what we're doing, so that we can give you better show, better answers to questions that you're looking for, we're absolutely open to that. And I think that would be a great segue into ending the episode too. Don't you think so?
No, no, just kidding. I agree. Yeah, I was just being, yes, no. Yeah, I think this was a great episode. I look forward to discussing, this kind of thing a lot more often in the future.
Awesome. Talk to you guys soon. Take care. Bye bye from the Cambrian explosion.
Cheers. Take care.